It's great to talk in front of an unknown audience because it doesn't happen very often. And if you hear the term human rights in relation to the Korean Peninsula, most people would associate it with North Korea. But there are, as I soon will come to, good reasons to include the issue also in assessing politics in South Korea. So let me begin by explaining the reason for undertaking the study. Since 1987, South Korea is regarded as a democracy. The democratization in 1987 meant that direct elections for president was introduced, but in addition to that, political freedom expanded, but at the same time, a political system can never work as it is supposed to be in textbooks. It is implemented by people and in different cultural contexts in the world. So to assess how a political system works, human rights is an important issue, and in my opinion, too little reported in the case of South Korea. A second reason that has to do with what I said is quality of democracy. We often hear the word democracy, and no word has, in my opinion, a more positive connotation than democracy, but we always have to ask what it actually means. One term used to assess this is democratic consolidation, which has many definitions, and the two easiest ones are one, the only game in town, referring to the opinion in society that no other political system is acceptable, and number two, the two turnover test, referring to two changes of government, that is from government to opposition after the introduction of democracy. But there are many more criteria to apply, and I will explain some of them somewhat later. A third issue, third reason is that human rights is a universal issue and contested in world politics. I think few people would associate Sweden with criticism from the UN Human Rights Council, but that has happened this week for one reason, and that is disrespecting the indigenous Sami people's rights to decide on issues concerning themselves. And let me add in this context that Sweden is a country, or at least some Swedes want to emphasize that respecting indigenous rights, indigenous people's rights is important, but Sweden has, in contrast to Norway, not ratified the ILO Convention number 169 on indigenous people's rights. So congratulations to Norway. Is here, and it's more important to explain how to find the answers. So what I did was to base the study on three documents. One is the world famous Universal Declaration of Human Rights from 1948 that was created in the context of the world having experienced the Holocaust. So that is a kind of Magna Carta in the human rights field, and forms to a large extent the basis of the 1987 constitution in South Korea that is still enforced. And then the third document is from the National Human Rights Commission formed in 2001. There are some discrepancies between the documents that I will explain with the two first, but the third I will exclude for the sake of time. Articles in the UDHR as it is abbreviated, and one term we can discuss to the end of this day what it means is relevant, but relevant in this study refers to what is possible to measure. Because if we talk about how an article has been implemented, we need to find concrete data about that, and that is not easy to find with all the articles. So I selected those that are possible to assess. So here we have articles regarding prohibition of slavery, torture, equality before the law, and then going on, we have freedom of thoughts, conscience, religion, freedom of opinion and expression, and also freedom of peaceful assembly and association. And then if we go to the 1987 Constitution, I will first point out articles that differ from the Universal Declaration, and they have all to do with the establishment of political parties. So on one hand, you see in the first Article 8.1 that if you follow what is written there, the political system should work perfectly. But then we have potential restrictions following ones expressed in them, democratic in their objectives, for instance, and contrary to the fundamental democratic order. If you see these words, you can understand that they are interpretable, and as I will come to in more detail soon, the major difficulty in terms of implementing human rights on the Korean Peninsula is the tensions between the two Koreas. The final point here has to do with equality before the law, and that no discrimination should take place. And then the other ones here have all a relationship between with the Universal Declaration: personal liberty, torture, freedom of religion, freedom of speech, and press. Going on then to theory and method, where there are, as I said, several definitions of democratic consolidation. I include those here that have most relevance for the free opinion of expression, freedom of expression, which is crucial for a political system to work. So, for instance, civil rights is important in the first point, and have to be fulfilled for a political system to work properly, or that we have a working civil society that, in the case of South Korea, has supplemented the work of political parties, and rule of law is also important because if law doesn't work, it means that there is a risk for abuse of power. Point number 2 here about civil society, I already said that it's important, meaning that there must be space for it to work. And in the case of the establishment of the National Human Rights Commissions, South Korean NGOs, non-governmental organizations, played a crucial role. So that's an important point to point out. We have the term political society here, referring to the space to exercise control over public power. So there must be possibilities for the general public to protest the government. And also we have the issue of rule of law also on the last point, that political actors must follow it. Of a thematic and chronological account, meaning that certain issues were raised, as I soon will come to, and to find out answers to the two questions recorded here. I also intended to do a qualitative assessment by applying definitions of democratic consolidation. And finally, one thing that was important to do was to find consecutive data over time, which always is important in social science, because then we can know trends over time. I made one visit to Korea in 2019-20 to find materials, and some of the materials I found were books that in some cases not cover the issue in detail, but anyhow were helpful, which also is the case to some books I found in Sweden. Articles were also possible to find both in Korea and Sweden, but what was particularly important to find in Korea was by visiting the library of the National Human Rights Commission, materials in Korea on issues that would have been difficult to research otherwise. And I also made some supplements through internet later, which turned out to be important in the case of one of the issues included. In the case of non-Korean material, particularly those issued by Amnesty International and the American State Department, were important, because particularly by the American State Department that annually issues reports on the state of human rights all over the world. You can find what issues are recurring regularly, and also find out how assessments made compared to those made in Korea. In the case of Amnesty International, there are both publications focusing on the general situation and particular cases. And the particular cases were useful to find information about, because assessments of the articles I mentioned were in many cases based on specific cases to avoid basing assessments onto general data, because if you do so, you don't get depth in the study, which is important to do. I already said, so let me say that the time period covered was from 1988, when the first president elected during the democratic era began his rule. Before 1948 and 87, one characteristic of the South Korean political system is that there was only one peaceful transfer of power, and Korea was known, and in this case, I mean both North and South Korea, for human rights abuses. And the most infamous example in South Korea is, of course, the 1980 Gwangju democratization movement, or as it should be called if you refer to the suppression of freedom, the Gwangju massacre, that to a certain extent remains an unresolved issue in the country. Study then. Here I base the first chapter on legislation and human rights institutions. And the order here should not be regarded as a ranking of what is most important or least important, but just a practical order. But it's not a coincidence, but that the national security law is first here. The law was introduced in 1948 by the first government led by Syngman Rhee at the time when there were tensions between the two Koreas and fears for communist infiltration in the South. And the law contains an article saying that it's impossible to visit North Korea, which isn't called North Korea in the law. It's called anti-state organization, or so North Korea is not mentioned in the law, but you cannot go there without government permission, meaning that everyone here can go more easily to North Korea than people in South Korea. And there is also a contested writing in Article 7 that acts benefiting or praising the enemy are prohibited. And this article has been criticized not only for its vague formulation, but also by being abused by successive presidents to get rid of opponents who may not have done anything related to tense inter-Korean relations. So this law is important to include, and I will come back to it. The Constitutional Court was set up in 1988 to protect the Constitution, and I will give examples of what it actually has done. The National Human Rights Commission I mentioned, and it is an agency to raise complaints by the ordinary public, and is considered to have raised the general knowledge about human rights issue. International human rights law is important for any country, and all countries in the world have accepted the Universal Declaration, and many have also ratified the following human rights treaties being signed on, for instance, economic and political rights, as well as social and political rights. But it's more difficult to implement them. Finally, in the case of institutions, it's important to mention the Universal Periodic Review, UPR, which is a new mechanism introduced following the reorganization of what was the UN Commission on Human Rights to the UN Human Rights Council in 2006. This isn't a lecture about the UN, but it's worth knowing here, since it's related to what I said about human rights being a contested issue, that The predecessor was criticized by being a politicized agency. So, for instance, countries abstained from voting if they knew that they commit human rights abuses and didn't want to receive criticism from another country. And often there was particular criticism of certain countries, a good example being Israel, while China hardly was criticized. So a purpose of this reorganization was to avoid such a situation, but it has failed. So even the UN Human Rights Council is a politicized agency which has not been working very well. But this new mechanism, which is implemented since 2008, and means that all UN member countries, 193, almost all independent countries, are reviewed every 4.5 years. And in this way, the outside world can point out what should be reformed or revised. And for instance, the national security law is always mentioned in the case of South Korea. This is an important mechanism that puts pressure on countries to act. Continuing to the so important question of inter-Korean relations and human rights, we have the impact of the national security law, meaning that there are numerous people who both before 1987 and after were imprisoned due to this law, and in many cases on dubious circumstances. So it's pointed out as the main obstacle to full political freedom in South Korea. A second issue that is not equally well known, at least outside the Korean Peninsula, is dispatch of leaflets across the border. Something that has been done by North Korean activists. So they use balloons to send leaflets, USB sticks containing information about South Korea and critical of the North Korean government. I have not seen many data and have no data in the study of the diffusion of leaflets, but got to know during my visit that very few of respondents had read them, and in most cases, representatives of state agencies catch them. So I doubt whether they are effective to spread information. Following severe criticism by North Korea, the South Korean government in 2020 introduced a new law prohibiting sending leaflets over the border, and penalties were introduced for those who did so. Last year, the Constitutional Court found out that this was not compatible with the Constitution, so that law has been cancelled. If it has been replaced by some other legislation, I don't know, but I well understand that the Constitutional Court, which in other cases have played a conservative role, did so. Another issue where the Constitutional Court long had a conservative role but changed its view between 2015 and 20 was the issue of consensus objectors. Most consensus objectors in South Korea have been Jehovah's Witnesses, and at one time there were more imprisoned consensus objectors in South Korea than in all other countries in the whole world combined. For that reason, there was criticism both within and outside Korea to introduce alternative service, which happened in 2019. But the issue is not completely resolved because the period of service, for instance, in some public service was twice as long as military service would be. So criticism against this from Amnesty International said it's a kind of new penalty for persons being consensus objectors. The third chapter investigates specific issues, freedom of expression, assembly, and association, focusing on certain issues like the well-reported candlelight demonstrations in 2008 when there were protests against the policy intending to allow imports of beef from America. Then we have an issue that I feel special, have special feelings for, the LGBT issue, and the reason for that is this is an issue that not is only related to the political system, but to the human mind. There are people being attracted by the same sex, and why should they be punished? That is not an idea that every Korean would agree with. And in the world, there are only 37 of 196 countries allowing same-sex marriages. So this is a contested issue almost everywhere. And many Koreans, particularly older people, have very conservative opinions about this. And to study this issue, publications by a Korean institute were very important, more so than from the American State Department. A well-known issue is the trials of two ex-presidents in 1995-96, No Teo and Chon Do-won, which are related to the issue of equality before the law. And by punishing them for receiving bribes and the Gwangju incident, as it is also called, you can say that equality for the law was implemented in this case. But whether it is so on a general level is much more difficult to assess. But since the circumstances behind the trials were dubious, since it began at a period when President Kim Jong-sam had a bad election result and wanted to divert attention from this issue by raising an issue that was supported by many in the public. You should not overestimate the significance of the jailings, and they didn't serve in jail for more than roughly 1.5 years. Death penalty has not an article explicitly referring to it in the Universal Declaration, but it has to do with the right to life, and it's something that is criticized by opponents by not being deterring. You can make wrong decisions, meaning that someone is executed who didn't commit a crime. And also it's said that the people who are sentenced to death belong to the weakest segments of a population. In the case of South Korea, they have still death penalty, but no one has been executed since December 1997, meaning that Amnesty International regards the country as a de facto abolitionist state. And I believe that no one will become executed, since it would create a bad image of the country worldwide. Right now, the Constitutional Court is reviewing whether the death penalty is compatible with the Constitution or not. It did so also before and found it compatible. I wonder what will happen if it finds that it is not compatible. Perhaps that could be the first step to abolish the death penalty, on a demand raised by Amnesty International. Also in the Human Rights Council, the issue has been raised. So this would be an important improvement of the political system. The most difficult issue to find data about was human trafficking. And here we come to an issue that, to my knowledge, is the most severe abuse of human rights taking place in Europe. So people are sold, and you all understand what the reason for this is. But to find out how many people are involved in this dirty trade, and how many women are affected, is very difficult. So I didn't find out concrete data here. But the main thing to point out here is that the main obstacle to find a solution is what I called commercial interests involved. Finally, torture is prohibited, as you saw in the Universal Declaration, as well as the 1987 Constitution, and it has not taken place on a regular level, regularly, as was the case before 1988. So that's an improvement, but still we have had some cases of torture leading to death. A challenge in the study was to find particularly consistent data, but it turned out to be possible to resolve. Coming then to the how much weight to give to each criteria, that wasn't so easy to decide. It was important to include the national security law, since it's so often mentioned, but I also wanted to raise issues not equally well known, such as the LGBT issue, and also death penalty. Coming then finally to the end, the basic conclusion is that the significance of the 1987 Constitution should not be overvaluated. Since there are deficiencies in the political system in this field, you can raise other examples as well, and it shows that it always takes time to make a political system work. And a final point is that it is my hope that by pointing out deficiencies in the political system, Korean policymakers as well as political activists will become more known. So during my visit to Korea, I donated one book to the National Human Rights Commission and also to the National Assembly Library. And at a visit to an organization working with human rights in North Korea, they asked me if there is a study about human rights in South Korea, and mentioned this book. So I hope they will purchase it, because if Korea's records improve in this field, it will not only be good for ordinary people, but also contribute to raise the country's global reputation. Thank you for listening.